The orangutan would not let go of Jim Fowler's neck, not in the playful way animals sometimes cling to handlers on television. This was different, tighter, more desperate. And Jim Fowler, the man who had walked into the jungles of Borneo, who had held pythons and faced down crocodiles without flinching, sat in that guest chair on the Tonight Show stage on October 13, 1977, and went completely still. Because he understood something in that moment that the audience did not. Something that Johnny Carson could not have known. Something that made the most composed wildlife expert in television history look directly at the camera with eyes that were wet. The baby orangutan clinging to his chest had a name, and that name was the reason Jim Fowler had almost not come to the show at all. He had driven to NBC studios in Burbank that afternoon with something heavy sitting inside him. A story he had been carrying for 3 weeks. A story about a rainforest, a dying mother, and a small creature that had chosen to survive against every odd that nature and man had stacked against it. He had not planned to tell it. Not tonight. Not on camera. But then Johnny asked a single question that unlocked everything, and 30 million Americans discovered that the world's most dangerous animals are never the ones people expect. Stay with me, because what Jim Fowler said next made Johnny Carson go completely silent for the longest moment in that season of the show. And it will change how you think about loss and survival and the things we hold on to when everything else is gone. Hit that like button right now and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight, because this story deserves to travel. October 13th, 1977. The Tonight Show was taping at 5:30 in the afternoon, as it always did in those years, inside Studio One at NBC Burbank. Johnny Carson arrived at his usual hour, unhurried, precise. He had hosted this program for 15 years by then. He knew every camera angle, every beat, every silence. His gray leisure suit was pressed. His tie was knotted exactly right. There was nothing unusual about the day until the stage manager knocked on his dressing room door 40 minutes before taping and said 3 words that Johnny had learned over a decade and a half to approach with great caution.
I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
Animal segment, tonight. Johnny set down his notepad. Animal segments meant anything. They meant a python draped around Ed McMahon's shoulders. They meant a hawk landing on the wrong camera. They meant chaos dressed up in fur or scales or feathers, delivered with the cheerful confidence of men who genuinely did not understand that other people found their hobbies terrifying. Johnny did not dislike animals. He was not afraid of them exactly. But he had developed a healthy respect for the unpredictability that followed them through that curtain. He straightened his tie and walked toward the green room to introduce himself. Jim Fowler was already there. He was 39 years old in 1977, lean and sun-darkened, with the kind of quiet physical confidence that belongs to people who have spent years in places where being nervous is a luxury you cannot afford. And he had made his name on Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, alongside Marlin Perkins, the beloved naturalist show that had been a fixture of American Sunday evenings since the early 1960s. If Marlin Perkins was the voice of Wild Kingdom, patient and professorial, Jim Fowler was its body. He was the one who went in. He was the one who climbed, swam, pursued, and occasionally got bitten. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most experienced wildlife handlers alive. And tonight he had brought a baby orangutan. The animal was sitting against Jim's chest when Johnny walked in, one long rust-colored arm wrapped over Jim's left shoulder, the other gripping the collar of his light blue field shirt. Its eyes were enormous, dark and searching, moving from face to face in the room with an alertness that felt almost uncomfortably intelligent. So Johnny looked at it. It looked at Johnny. Neither of them moved for a moment. "How old?" Johnny asked. "About 8 months," Jim said. "Maybe a little less." "It's very calm." Jim looked down at the animal. Something passed across his face that Johnny noticed but could not quite read. "She's always calm," he said. "She's used to people now." Johnny did not push. He had learned after 15 years that guests who had something real to say would say it when the cameras were rolling. You did not take those moments in the green room. You let them find the light. The taping began. The monologue landed. Johnny sat behind his desk in that wood-paneled set, the painted mountain backdrop behind him, and the hour moved the way it always moved, with the practiced ease of a machine that had been running long enough to feel effortless. Ed McMahon laughed from his chair. Doc Severinson's band played between segments. The audience settled into the familiar rhythm of the thing. And then Jim Fowler walked through the curtain. The audience saw the orangutan before they saw much else. There was an immediate, collective intake of breath, the sound a crowd makes when something unexpected is also undeniably beautiful. The animal rode against Jim's chest the way a very young child rides a parent, her face pressed slightly into his shoulder, her eyes scanning the new environment. Jim moved carefully, deliberately, the way a man moves when he is carrying something breakable. Subscribe right now, because what happens in the next few minutes of this taping is something that was never planned, never scripted, and was never supposed to leave that studio the way it did. So Johnny stood and extended his hand. Jim shook it with his free arm, the one not serving as a perch. The audience laughed warmly when the orangutan turned to examine Johnny with an expression that seemed almost skeptical. "She doesn't look convinced," Johnny said. Jim smiled. "She takes a little while." They sat. The conversation began the way wildlife conversations on The Tonight Show always began, with Johnny asking practical questions and Jim answering with the relaxed authority of someone who had been explaining the natural world to television audiences for years. He talked about Borneo, about the rainforest canopy where orangutans spend the majority of their lives, rarely descending to the ground, building fresh sleeping nests each night in the high branches. He talked about their intelligence, which is extraordinary, and their solitary nature, which is unusual among great apes. He talked about how slowly they reproduce, one infant every 6 to 8 years, which makes every single birth a profound event in the life of a population. Johnny was listening. The audience was listening. But what nobody had noticed yet was that the orangutan had, sometime in the past few minutes, shifted her grip. She had moved from Jim's shoulder to his neck. Both arms now wrapped tight. Her face turned inward, not exploring the room anymore. Something else. Johnny noticed first. "She's holding on a little differently now," he said. Jim looked down. He did not speak right away. The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds something changed in the studio. The audience felt it without knowing why. Johnny felt it. Ed McMahon, he who had seen thousands of moments from that chair beside the desk, later said he knew in that pause that the conversation was about to become something different from what anyone had prepared for. "She does that sometimes," Jim said quietly, "when she gets reminded." Johnny waited. He had a gift for waiting. 22 million people watching from their living rooms, and he simply waited. The way you wait when you know a person is standing at the edge of something they need to say. "Reminded of what?" Johnny asked. Jim looked at the animal against his chest for a long moment. Then he looked up. 3 weeks ago," he said, "we were in Borneo. A logging operation had come through an area where a small group of orangutans had been living. The mother of this one was found on the ground." He stopped. "Started again?" "Orangutans don't come to the ground unless something is already wrong. She was injured. She had been holding this one for as long as she could." He adjusted his arm slightly, the small shift of a man who has been carrying something for a long time. "She didn't survive. The studio had gone quiet in the way studios go quiet when something real walks in. This animal, Jim continued, held on to her mother for 2 days after she died. The people who found them couldn't get her to let go. Not for 2 full days. His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight, and his eyes were the eyes of someone who has seen something they will not entirely recover from. She was not even 8 months old. She didn't understand what had happened. She only knew that if she held on long enough, something would come back. Johnny did not speak. He had his hands folded on the desk. He was completely still. When she finally let go, Jim said, they called us, and I have been carrying her ever since. He looked down at the orangutan, who had her face pressed against the side of his neck, both arms locked around him. That's what she's doing right now. When she gets overstimulated, or when something feels unfamiliar, she holds on like that, like she's remembering. You are not going to want to look away from what Johnny does next. Keep watching. For a moment, nobody said anything. The audience, all 300 people in that room, sat in a silence that felt collective and private at the same time. There was no nervous laughter. No one coughed. The cameras kept rolling. Johnny leaned forward slightly. His voice, when he found it, was softer than his regular register. But the professional warmth had given way to something underneath it. "Does she know you now?" he asked. "Does she know you're not going anywhere?" Jim considered this, the kind of considered pause that means someone is deciding whether to give you the real answer or the easy one. "I think she's starting to," he said. "But I don't think she trusts it yet. I don't think she's ready to believe that what she holds on to will stay." He looked at Johnny. "That takes time. That might take a long time." Johnny nodded slowly, and then he said something that was not on any card, not in any briefing, not part of any planned segment. He said it quietly, almost to himself, but the microphone caught it, and 30 million people heard it. "Don't we all know something about that?" The audience exhaled. It was not applause. So it was something closer to recognition, the sound a room makes when someone has said the exact true thing. Ed McMahon, who had watched Johnny for 15 years, looked over at his friend. Johnny was looking at the orangutan, at the way her arms gripped Jim's neck with the absolute commitment of a creature who has already learned what it cost to lose everything. Johnny's expression was not performing anything. It was just a man in a lit studio being moved by something small and real. Jim reached up and placed one hand gently against the orangutan's back. She did not loosen her grip, but something in the line of her small body seemed to ease just slightly, the way a held breath finally lets go. "What happens to her now?" Johnny asked. "She'll go to a rehabilitation program," Jim said. "The goal is eventually to get her back into the wild, into a protected area, somewhere the logging hasn't reached." He paused. "It's a long process. She has to learn everything her mother would have taught her, how to find food, how to build a nest, how to be an orangutan." He looked down at her. "Right now she just knows how to hold on. We have to teach her the rest." Johnny was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that nobody expected. "Can I hold her?" Jim looked at him. "A beat? She might not go to you." "That's all right," Johnny said. "She doesn't have to." Jim stood and approached the desk, and Johnny came around from behind it, and they stood there in the soft television light, 2 men in a quiet studio, and Jim held the orangutan out toward Johnny with both hands, the way you offer something precious and uncertain. And the orangutan, who had not left Jim's body since the cameras started rolling, looked at Johnny Carson for a long moment with those searching dark eyes. She reached out one hand, small fingers, ancient-looking, the way primate hands always look, like they belong to something older than the room they're in. She touched Johnny's forearm. Johnny went completely still. He did not move. He barely breathed. She studied his face. studying it the way she had studied the green room, the way she had studied the audience, with that alertness that felt too knowing for something so small. And then she held on, both arms, against Johnny's chest. Johnny stood there with his arms wrapped carefully around her, and his face did something it very rarely did on camera. It stopped performing entirely. What was underneath was something quieter and more private, something that belonged to a man who understood, in his own way, what it meant to hold tight to things and still lose them. The audience did not applaud. They sat in silence for almost a full minute, while Johnny stood in the middle of his own set, holding a grieving baby orangutan who had decided, for reasons known only to herself, to let him be the thing she held on to. When he finally handed her back to Jim, his voice was careful. "You'll take good care of her," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Jim said simply. Johnny nodded. He walked back behind his desk and sat down. He looked at his index cards. He set them aside. "I think we should take a break," he said to the audience. His voice was back, composed and warm. But something in him had shifted. Nay, and everyone in the room knew it had shifted, and nobody was going to pretend otherwise. They went to commercial, and when they came back, the conversation continued, easy and full of stories, Jim talking about the work of Wild Kingdom, the places he had been, the animals he had known. But the room had been changed by what happened in those minutes, the way rooms sometimes get changed by things that don't have any business happening on television and happen anyway. That October episode was remembered for years by the people who watched it, not for anything dramatic or loud, not for a revelation or a confession or a moment of planned emotion, for something quieter, for the image of a small animal holding on to whatever would hold her back, for a wildlife expert with steady hands and eyes that had seen too much sitting in a television guest chair and telling the truth about grief without ever using the word, and for Johnny Carson, the most controlled man in late-night television, standing in the middle of his own studio with his arms full of something that needed him. The baby orangutan went on to a rehabilitation sanctuary in Southeast Asia, cared for by one of the early conservation programs that would later become a model for orangutan recovery efforts across Borneo and Sumatra. She was released into a protected reserve area approximately 3 years after that taping. Jim Fowler continued his work with Wild Kingdom until the show's end and remained one of the most recognized wildlife educators in the country, devoting decades to conservation advocacy at a time when the word conservation was not yet the household term it would become. Johnny Carson never spoke publicly about that night in any specific detail, but the people who worked the show said he kept a photograph in his dressing room for years. Not of a celebrity, not from any famous interview, a photograph of a small rust-colored animal in a man's arms, both of them holding on, taken by a camera operator during a commercial break when neither of them knew anyone was watching. Jim Fowler had said it. She only knew that if she held on long enough, something would come back. And in the end, something did. Not what she had lost. It never does. But something, a hand, a chest, a warmth that stayed long enough to teach her that the world still had things in it worth trusting. That is what animals know that we spend our whole lives trying to learn. That holding on is not weakness. That grief that refuses to let go is not broken. It is, in its own way, the most honest thing a living creature can do. If this story reached something in you, hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you stories like this one, stories that happen in the spaces between the cameras and the scripts, in the moments when real life walks onto a television stage and refuses to be managed. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded tonight that it is all right to hold on, that needing something to hold is not a flaw. It is the most human thing there is. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me about something you have held on to, because that is what this community is for. And because sometimes the bravest thing in the room is 8 months old and doesn't know yet that it's going to be all right. And sometimes the job of everyone else in the room is just to hold on back.